Coalition for Nuclear Disarmament and Peace is very proud to organize this jointly with ICAN, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, and the Pakistan-India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy. May I request Achin Vanayak to summarize the main points that Tilman Roof made. Also, some of you have just come in, so it might be useful from that point of view as well.
The importance of having a prohibition treaty of no use and no possession. First point, of course, is that the danger of nuclear weapons has not diminished in any way, even though there is an impression that it has. The second point was that there has been significant advance in outlawing other terrible weapons. For example, biological weapons, chemical weapons, landmines, etc. And that this is a kind of anomaly in the sense that we have not been able to move towards outlawing this kind. The fact that we have outlawed these other means doesn't mean that they don't exist, but the fact that they've been outlawed is a considerable step forward. Third, this process of moving towards a prohibition treaty can be done and initiated without the nuclear weapon states to begin with. I suppose in many ways the Ottawa Treaty for landmines represents a kind of model that could be followed here. Fourth, that there has been increasing involvement of a number of very important international civil society bodies, most prominently the International Red Cross Committee for the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. It's also taking place in a context in which there have been a number of resolutions about the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons, which have been emerging from time to time, and the emphasis on this humanitarian aspect is particularly important. In fact, there is the proposal that is being put forward now is taking place within a context in which there is an increasing appeal of such an approach if it is measured by the number of governments that have moved over the last few years from not endorsing to endorsing such appeal, from something like 16 governments to 122 governments who have now come on board in terms of opposing that. The humanitarian aspect, which is being emphasized, has now become embedded in the NPT discussions that take place at the review conferences and yearly, and of course also for the first time you have governments, the Red Cross, big other civil society organizations and specialized UN agencies, the good works aspect of the UN, which are now taking this up and have also emphasized this. There might also be, next point is that there might be a commitment by a number of states now to specify a timeline and start negotiations on such a treaty. So this too is a very important point. And recent high-level meetings at the UN have recognized the importance of stigmatizing nuclear weapon states and to create pressure on companies and banks which have directly or indirectly involved themselves in the production of such weapons and of weapons generally and nuclear weapons, and that it is now necessary to reach out to a public through such an approach to put pressure into and because of the moral dimension, that they can start divesting their investments in such companies that are related to production, and even in banks which are connected to such activities. In fact, the biggest bank of Sweden has been influenced so that it has now divested itself from such clients. You have some $6 billion worth of investment in weapons production, or companies that are producing weapons production. He mentioned two in India. I only could catch one, which was Larsen Toubro. The second one I couldn't catch.
LIC.
No, the LIC has got 2.7 billion investment in two companies. But what was the other company? I'm not sure. And Tata Industries. It's Larsen Toubro and Tata. And the Life Insurance Corporation of India, out of that 6 billion, is investing something like $2.7 billion in these two companies. The importance of having such a treaty and moving towards this is taking place in a context in which the nuclear weapon states are very deliberately neglecting the issue. And so the appeal to the moral concerns of the public is particularly important, even when there is a possibility that regional conflict, for example in South Asia, as a result of the India-Pakistan face-off, is real. And in fact, what recent studies have shown is that even a very small nuclear conflict This is not the nuclear winter argument, it's a little variation on that, that even a very small nuclear conflict of less than half of 1% of the use of existing nuclear weapons would have enormous consequences for food production over the next decade in some of the most important food producing areas, of course, India, China, elsewhere. And according to current statistics, would have a devastating effect on billions of people. And that is why, these are some of the reasons why it is necessary, Dr. Tillman said, to reduce the spread and to move towards, reduce the spread of nuclear weapons and to move towards their elimination. That is basically the summary of the points that were made.
All arms are bad. They may be small, they may be big, they may be nuclear, they may be non-nuclear. And all wars are bad. They may be local, they may be regional, they may be world wars. So I want to begin with that. That is where the whole issue of unnecessary expenditure on armaments and then at the cost of human development and the needs which the people have not being met. So beginning with that, I would like to say that it is something to do with the political domination, economic domination, it is something to do with coercion, it is something to do with the hegemony, it is something to do with blackmail, it is something to do with intimidation, domination. When we talk of these weapons of any kinds, and especially now when we are talking of nuclear weapons and now the new kinds of weapons which are coming up, which Tillman was mentioning, it has something to do with that. The genesis is also there and the history tells that and present day situation also tells that. I just want to quote a historical fact. Our friends from Japan are sitting here. You see, when the Second World War was just coming to an end, it already ended in Europe and it was just to end in Asia also. It would have ended in another 15 days or 20 days or maximum another 1 month or so. Rather, experts feel that it would have ended by within 10 or 15 days. And the meeting was taking place between allied powers. They were sitting in Potsdam and they were reviewing all that whole World War situation in Europe. Reichstag had already fallen and it was after that the meeting taking place. And the top leaders of all the allied forces were sitting there. And they were planning how in Asia when the things end there also and what is going to happen of Europe, what will they do about Germany. And discussion was going on. Some part was under French, some part was where Soviet Union had reached with arms and some was with UK and Americans had reached. All that discussion was going on and suddenly one telegram reaches there. And it reaches in the hands of American President. It comes from United States of America. After looking at that telegram, he gets up, stops the meeting and says, "Gentlemen, we'll talk later." The meeting ends. The telegram had only one small message, that twin baby is born. So fat boy and small boy were born. And he immediately leaves. And it's part of history that he wanted to experiment of that, testing of those weapons, those two first atom bombs in the human history. The scientists had opposed. The peace lovers had opposed. But the first of all, the scientists themselves had opposed. And we know how they were tortured and they were put into prisons. Even when the war would have ended without using of those atom bombs, why United States of American government chose to use those at Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Because he was very clear. The President of USA, the then President of USA was very clear. British Empire is falling down, tearing apart, and now new empire in the world should be there on the scene. And we must show the world it is we who are the new empire. So it was something to do with the hegemony. It was something to do which will lead ultimately not only for political influence, but ultimately to lead to profits and control of markets in new ways, if not in the form of First World War or Second World War, which was meant for redistribution of colonies. So it was a new way, a weapon had come in the hands, and they said that the world must know what is the power. And that's why the testing will not be on deserts, testing will not be on seawater, testing will be on humans and on the populations where you have maximum population over there, so that world could see what have we acquired, the kind of power we have acquired. That's why I said instrument of blackmail, instrument of hegemony, all these weapons are small, big and all these war situations. So those weapons, when they were used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had politics behind it, had economy behind it, had hegemony behind it, had an idea of instrument of blackmail for future. Just now we heard Tillman and many more presentations, and long work of CNDP continuously bringing out this piece now, always coming out with statistics. Everything tells only one thing, and that one thing is that all these armament race, increase of arms is eating into our resources. Our economic resources are spent over there, whereas on the other hand side we are having so many international treaties, conferences, good documents are coming, millennium goals are being set up. We talk of education to all, health to all, sanitation issue, drinking water issue, poverty, hunger, food security. All these are international discourse also, not only within the countries. So these weapons and these continuous armament race in this form is actually eating away into the resources, whereas humanity at large is suffering. These two things are intertwined also, because when you talk of hegemony, when you talk of controlling of markets, when you want to sell for maximizing your profits as companies, those who are producing weapons, and as powers who are depending on those companies or are pursuing their cause, or they are dictated by them in whichever form, wherever, in whichever country, in whichever form it is existing. And that's why it is very important to work at all levels. It is important to work at civil society level, it is important to work with the governments, to negotiate, to talk to them, to put forth both the points. Praful in the beginning was saying that we have been working with the people, campaigning and all, but we have not influenced the powers at all. This is how the civil society organizations, the political movements influence the powers, by mobilizing public opinion, by being with them. Another thing in history within India, if I talk about, I want to share two experiences with you. After that first test during Vajpayee's government, when I was there in Punjab, in Patiala, a very big workers' rally was there. And Indrajit Gupta, General Secretary of AITUC and also a communist leader, he was to address this rally and I was there. And it was just the previous day this explosion had happened.
May 11th.
Huh? May 11th. I am talking of May 12th. And you imagine, it was AITUC rally, which is committed against nuclear weapons. And it was masses of workers of AITUC unions who are very much against any kind of war between India, Pakistan or any part of the world. Then Indrajit Gupta is to address. I am behind a few of our leaders, not everybody, come to me. and tell Inderjeet ji, when he addresses, not to condemn that explosion. He should be cautious in his words. And there are others on my side who are saying, no, let him say. Because Communist Party of India had already taken position against that. AITUC had already taken position against that. And we said the government has entered into a very, very dangerous zone. What they have done is against people of India, against humanity at large. We had already taken position, and this was known to the comrades who were present there. So they were fearing, as National Secretariat member of Communist Party and as AITUC General Secretary, if he speaks, there are people around. Why they said it? Because after that explosion, within India, if you remember, as if you oppose it, then you are unbecoming of a patriot. That was the environment. But Inderjeet Gupta spoke, and he said, because I did not tell Comrade Inderjeet Gupta not to speak on this. I listened to those comrades, and I said, you keep mum. He is a wise person, he will speak what he has to speak, and you are not going to tell or influence. And later on, after the meeting, I had to sit with comrades for 3-4 hours in the night, a few of them. It was a fear of kind of environment which was generated after that. So that is why work at whatever level we do, how small organization it is, how big organization it, wherever it is affiliated or non-affiliated, working at political level, social, cultural level, anywhere it is working, when we speak for peace, when we speak for disarmament, everyone's work is valuable because it's something to do with environment generation. And I also remember when here in Delhi, we organized a protest demonstration, and that protest demonstration was to be at ITO crossing. And I remember how many people trying to telephoning me, that means they must have telephoned others also, telling tum pit jaoge wahan, tumhari pitai hogi, why are you daring to do? And you know, Delhi is polarized when it comes to elections. You know, the elections are proceeding, how between Congress and BJP, now only in between people are hearing about another AAP also. But then it totally polarized and whole of environment. And I remember how the people were telling. If they were telling me, they must have been telling other activists also. So from that point of view, I think it's very, very important that we have to make the people understand how the resources are being eaten away, and how this has nothing to do with common man's life. It does not provide securities. It is actually, the wars have not decreased. Wars have increased. Only world wars are not happening. But regional conflicts and wars have killed much more people than even at a small level war, at a bigger size war for small days had happened. So that is the part of history which we know how to disseminate it, how to take to the people. As an activist, as a political person, as a trade unionist, I feel that our campaign has to be for seeking for action and activity by the people. Not only knowing the information and having with yourself, that kind of empathy and then kind of anguish, both the things have to be there. You have to feel for those who suffered in these wars, and then you have to be moving in the field that no such situations continue further, and how really we do it. This part we have to continue telling, that even when you convince the governments who are having nuclear weapons that they will not have first strike. From strategy point of view, we can say now begin with non-nuclear powers, then you begin with the nuclear powers and say, okay, you will not be the first strikers, and then trying for disarmament. That all can be a part of process. But objective goal, we have to tell the people, even when the governments agree for no first use, or saying, okay, weapons will keep lying there, we are never going to use it, but then by accident you are going to have war. some accident or the kind of terrorism which is spreading, you cannot ensure no theft will happen, you cannot ensure no accident will happen. So in any case, existence of these weapons on planet Earth is dangerous. That's the point we have to carry forward when we go for campaign, when we go for activities, wherever, in whichever form we do. From Communist Party of India, I remember after Pakistan exploded, here before concluding I want to say, after Pakistan exploded, there were some discussions, and I also went in a panel discussion. There was some seminar, workshops, and later on even Doordarshan discussions were there. They were telling me, so what if they have exploded? We have bigger capacity, we will make more weapons, and we will always be ahead of them. I just asked one question. After Bangladesh situation, when Bangladesh was born, 23 years, no war happened, and not even serious kind of skirmishes on the borders. Generally, at borders, certain things go on, not only between India, Pakistan, India, China, all that. Those small things, the army takes it as a routine. But I am talking of serious skirmishes or conflicts. Because Pakistan in that conventional situation never felt that they are going near India in their military preparation or equaling them ever. So there was already a situation of deterrence was there. There was no need for Indian government to show that we want to show that we are a bigger power and Pakistan cannot threaten. So that BJP fellow with whom I was arguing, I said, you tell me for 21 years, 23 years what was happening. And now rather after they exploded bombs, now they say we are equal to you. You sit there, I sit there, you are nuclear power, I am nuclear power. So we have done the deterrence nor they have done the deterrence. We have put ourselves on a, time bomb sort of situation. So we have not created a healthy situation in South Asia. We have done very something wrong, and onus lies on India. Even though our friends in the Congress were angry, why you are saying when we talked of previous exploit 74. Why do you mention about that and all? Because I said because that was done, then the second could also follow. But they were angry with me. But naturally, we have our viewpoint, and from that point of view, I do demarcate. There are people who say don't use nuclear energy at all, but there are people who say nuclear energy is used for other purposes also, for human welfare and health, and also you cannot oppose nuclear energy. You talk in terms of nuclear weapons and all. So there are different viewpoints. Fortunately, CNDP does not try to resolve that issue, dividing the people over there. Everybody is on board, and everybody together with their own organizations, perceptions and all, but agreeing upon on the minimum level is that the minimum level is we do not want any kind of arms race, and especially nuclear weapons to begin with, they need to be eradicated. And I agree with Tillman, we have not to, when we are discussing about nuclear weapons, we cannot close eyes on the new kind of things which are coming up. We have to continue opposing any kind of new forms and dangerous forms, whereas these chemical weapons is not a new thing. That is orange gas was used against Vietnam. What is the Agent Orange. So it's not something new, but then they becoming deadly. From atom bomb to today's nuclear bomb, it's more deadly and more dangerous. So from that point of view, new kind of things which are coming, and it is actually to tame others, to intimidate, to have hegemony, to control, and ultimately to lead to maximizing of profits by some companies who are the real producers of these weapons. So they are not for humanity. So humanitarian approach has to be there, of course, but then there has to be real tactical, strategical, all those approaches at various levels by various partners, whosoever is having whatever targeted objective and agenda the organizations are having from Communist Party of India. Once again, I thank you for giving this opportunity to me, and I assure, as far as we are concerned and the mass organizations where we work as communists also and otherwise many people over there, this agenda continues to be a serious agenda for all of us. That much I can assure you. Thank you.
It's a pity that there's such few events in the city. If you are particularly from the discipline of international relations, there's a great deal of strategic commentary, and you can clearly see that there is such an asymmetry in terms of the slants of emphasis. I think there is a lot of thought which goes into issues relating to strategy, but they tend to be focused or skewed around a certain set of questions and tend to neglect very much the basic fact that nuclear weapons don't portend well for any of us, and we need to be conscious of the fact that these are weapons. These are not instruments where you can necessarily use these weapons and win any war. It's a complete myth to believe that any war can be won by the use of these weapons. So I think it's important for us to, first of all, apprise ourselves of the fact that, brutally put, these weapons don't necessarily mean any well for humanity and human beings, and even those who invoke the national security argument need to be cautious in terms of clearly emphasizing the potential implications and risks they pose to their own populations by the use of these weapons. I'm interested in one particular facet relating to the nuclear weapon program and to nuclear weapons more generally, and this is the role of international law and what international law really has to offer in terms of thinking about nuclear disarmament issues. And I think it's important to recognize here that law can also be an ally in terms of a strategy to sort of get rid of these weapons. Law can work both ways. Law sometimes cements certain status quo positions. Law sometimes is used by the powerful to entrench particular interests. But law can also be an ally of the weak. Law can also be, I think the language of law is a specialized rhetoric which sometimes even nuclear weapon states which are keen to control are not successfully able to do so. So I think the moment a legal argument is invoked, it sometimes has a life of its own, which cannot be micromanaged even by the major powers. And this was evident specifically in one slice of legal history, which I think has a bearing in terms of how we think about nuclear disarmament issues. And this is the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, which was rendered in 1996. I'm going to focus on this particular slice of legal history because I think much of the arguments, much of the contestations which took place in this particular theater of the court, I think resonate much more widely in terms of disagreements and agreements about the nuclear question. To begin with, I think there is a fair amount of skepticism about whether law can be an ally itself in terms of thinking about nuclear disarmament. There are many who would summarily dismiss international law and say, how does international law matter in a world in which it's the major powers which basically decide how things run? And I found it interesting this morning when I was sort of looking at some of the work of even classical realists who are the most skeptical about the role of international law, do make a mention that law actually has a specific role. If you'd bear with me for a second, Hans Morgantha, one of the classical realists, had this to say about international law. He said, during the 400 years of its existence, quote, international law has in most instances been scrupulously observed. When one of its rules are violated, it was, however, not always enforced, and when action to enforce it was actually taken, it was not always effective. Yet to deny that international law exists at all as a system of binding legal rules flies in the face of all the evidence. So I think even those who sort of are very skeptical about the role of law itself and its workings in terms of reining in something as sinister as nuclear weapons recognize that it actually does have a certain potency and a certain set of possibilities which we need to, I think, particularly those interested in taking the movement to nuclear disarmament forward should consider as a useful resource. There are four facets I briefly want to flag in the next 15 minutes or so relating to the International Court of Justice and its advisory opinion of July 1996. The first relates to the context of the opinion. How did the opinion come about? What was the context in which you had a legal pronouncement for the first time on an issue like nuclear use? The second relates to the process. how did this occur? You didn't suddenly have an advisory opinion, a sudden willingness of the International Court of Justice to speak on an issue of this grave concern. And third, I think also the issue of outcome. How do we read the final outcome which emerged as a consequence of the court's deliberations on this question? We could also think perhaps of future implications. There is now a greater degree of interest in the idea of a nuclear weapon convention, which also perhaps at some point could bind countries into much more concrete commitments with regard to the idea of nuclear disarmament. To begin with, in terms of the context, I think we need to recognize that there has been considerable resistance by all the nuclear weapon states to any pronouncement on the legal status of nuclear use. If you look at the state submissions made to the International Court of Justice, these arguments come through so clearly. They constantly place an emphasis on the sovereign discretion of states to use nuclear weapons. They constantly invoke the idea of self-defense. And they basically are suggesting that it is not the business of the court to really reflect or to really pronounce on this question of nuclear use. And I think the legal question has been banished for a long time, partly because ever since the weapons were first used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you did have one judgment in what was called as the Shimoda case, where a 47-year-old Japanese man went to court and did actually make a case saying that the Americans need to pay up for these terrible damage they've caused in the context of Shimoda. And the court did invoke three principles in the context of Shimoda. I'll briefly mention what the indictment was. It said, first of all, that, quote, there were indiscriminate aerial bombardment of undefended cities, even if the cities did contain some military objectives. They were cruel and inhumane. 20% to 30% of the deaths were from burns. And the damage done was grossly disproportionate to any possible military objectives. So all these three dimensions were flagged off right at that point when the Shimoda judgment was granted in that particular phase in history. I think we need to look at this International Court of Justice and its effort to pronounce on the legality of nuclear use in the context of a broader normative legacy which exists in terms of the Hague Convention, in terms of the Hague Conferences, as well as the Geneva Protocols, to systematically think about restraints on the use of force. So I think we need to contextualize this particular effort by the court in the context of this prior legacy, the prior normative legacy, to think about ways in which international humanitarian law could apply in imposing certain restraints on the use of force. I think this particular opinion has generated both interest in theoretical terms as well as in terms of the broader history of imposing restraints on nuclear use. There was also a North-South divide even on this question. If you think about the position many developing countries, even the non-aligned movement at one point, clearly articulated was in favor of what is called as categorical illegality of nuclear use. This is in opposition to those who argue that not all situations of nuclear use merit a categorical legal prohibition. And this argument has survived right up to 1996, when the nuclear weapon states were using this argument to suggest that they're smart weapons, they're weapons which will not cause damage beyond a certain proportion, and all of these arguments still seem to be alive in various forms in the manner in which nuclear weapon states tend to invoke them. I also think that there were a whole range of issues surrounding nuclear testing in the South Pacific particularly. In 1954 you had what was called the Lucky Dragon episode, and India's first Prime Minister Nehru did actually suggest that these small little states, island states, were facing the brunt of the nuclear ambitions of the major powers. So I think this was quite clearly on the map even then, and more concretely, I think in terms of India's contribution to even this whole question of delegitimizing nuclear use, Ricky Jayapal, as recently as the 1980s, a former Indian ambassador to the United Nations, voiced the need to get an advisory opinion on this question and to build it into a legally binding treaty. So I think we need to think about the fact that there is clearly also support within the establishment at various points in sort of pushing the case towards nuclear disarmament. Even if you look at the Indian submission eventually to the court, the Indian memorial, it clearly makes a case for categorical illegality. So there is a certain consistency of position in terms of the case for an intrinsic illegality of nuclear use in the Indian arguments. In terms of the process, I think it's important to recognize that a whole range of international non-state actors were critical in terms of bringing the question to the court, bringing attention to this question, and eventually mobilizing opinion, both in terms of middle powers, NAM, the UN General Assembly. At various levels, you had what was called as the World Code Project, which involved a constellation of actors: International Peace Bureau, the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, and ILANA, which is International Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms. So you also had these epistemic, these knowledge-based communities of international lawyers, for instance, who were all committed normatively to delegitimizing nuclear use, who got together and worked a concerted strategy to get the question to the court in the light of the considerable opposition by the nuclear weapon states, and to eventually get an outcome from that procedure. It's also interesting to see how this question was cast. Initially, the World Health Organization approached the International Court of Justice, and it argued that given the health and environmental effects any situation of nuclear use poses, the World Health Organization will not be able to cope with an event of that magnitude. So in this context, it asked, in view of the health and environmental effects, would the use of nuclear weapons by a state in war or other armed conflict be a breach of its obligations under international law, including the WHO Constitution? And it's interesting to see that quite clearly this developmental argument incorporated in terms of opposition to nuclear weapons did resonate quite widely with a whole range of actors. And the court found itself in quite a quandary. It ultimately, of course, invoked a principle of speciality and argued that it was beyond the jurisdiction of the WHO to be concerned about the legal status of nuclear use. There were 5 arguments which were made by the nuclear weapon states against granting this request. The first argument is that they suggested that it was a political and not a legal question. The second claim they made was that there was no concrete issue at hand, and this was purely hypothetical. The third, that it was a vague and abstract request. And fourth, it might impact disarmament negotiations unduly. And finally, the court's task is merely to interpret and not to make law. It's interesting that the court overruled many of these objections, except the one on speciality, where it did suggest that this question seemed to be beyond the jurisdiction of the WHO. I think 3 judges from the developing world, Mohammad Shahabuddin, Abdul Kurama, and Judge Christopher Gregory Veeramantri, clearly voiced their opposition to the rejection of the WHO request. I think NAM also played an important role in making that request. And ultimately, you see that the WHO process itself, I think, galvanized the World Code Project, and the momentum was sustained until there was a subsequent request made by the United Nations General Assembly to the International Court of Justice, again asking, is a threat or use of nuclear weapons in any circumstance permitted under international law? Right at the outset of the movement, it's interesting to see that there were 2 points of view even within international lawyers and those who were committed to the idea of nuclear disarmament. Some suggested that there's already enough customary international law which basically delegitimizes nuclear weapons and nuclear. So did we really require a binding treaty sort of text in order to think about ways in which law could be an ally of nuclear disarmament? The others who argued that it was important still to get a concrete ruling on the specific question of nuclear use. If poison was unacceptable, clearly nuclear weapons are likely to be treated as unacceptable legally, and we need to fight that battle and get this pronouncement, a concrete legal pronouncement on this question. The court this time conceded to the request of the United Nations General Assembly, and it basically said it was discharging an essentially judicial task. So fortunately, the question survived, and it eventually reached the court, and the court was willing to pronounce on it this round. I think what is interesting is that this is the most widely participated advisory opinion in the history of the court. Several states made both oral submissions and written submissions. It's interesting to look at some of these arguments, and I'm just going to, if you indulge me, read 2 or 3 brief representative samples of the argument. I think it was fascinating to see that there was a disagreement between the Chinese judge on the bench, Judge Shi, and the American judge on the bench, Judge Schwebel. Now the court is supposed to represent the principal legal cultures of the world. The judges are supposed to be independent and not reflect what their foreign policy establishments at home are telling them. But very often you realize also that neutrality in the manner in which it's conceived does not necessarily play itself out in that fashion. There is a fictive element to the neutrality involved in some of these cases and renderings of advisory opinions. Now, in terms of the state submissions, what was interesting is, of course, that the South Pacific states, which were most badly affected by the earlier history of nuclear testing, clearly opposed any attempt at not sort of reaching out towards an outcome which would categorically ban all situations of nuclear use. In terms of the idea that nuclear weapon use could be permitted under certain circumstances, I think it was Judge Schwebel who made the case most strongly, and he suggested that, let me read a brief section where he says that the argument that international law prohibits in all cases the use of nuclear weapons appears to be premised on the incorrect assumption that every use of every type of nuclear weapons will necessarily share certain characteristics which contravene the law of armed conflict. Specifically, it appears to be assumed that any use of nuclear weapons will inevitably escalate into a massive strategic nuclear exchange, resulting automatically in the deliberate destruction of the population centers of opposing sides. This assumption is entirely unwarranted. It's based on myth, not fact. So quite clearly the accent here was to suggest that nuclear weapon use under certain circumstances is not going to cause the damage others suggested that it would cause. Many of these spurious arguments, I think, were defeated in the court in the light of concrete opposition by a number of states in their own statements with regard to these premises. But I think most importantly, the idea of an appreciable section of the international community. This was the language used by the United States Judge Schwebel. He said an appreciable section of the international community actually takes recourse to nuclear weapons, when he actually had 5 states in mind at that point. And Judge Xi of China, I think, contests this particular notion of what may be treated as the appreciable section of the international community. Let me just read a small section from this. Okay, so this is what Judge Schwebel has to say. The nuclear practice is not a practice of a lone and secondary persistent objector. This is not the practice of a pariah government crying out in the wilderness of otherwise adverse international opinion. This is the practice of 5 of the world's major powers, of the permanent members of the Security Council, significantly supported for almost 50 years by their allies and other states sheltering under their nuclear umbrellas. That is to say, it is the practice of states and a practice supported by a large and weighty number of other states that together represent the bulk of the world's military and economic and financial and technological power and a very large proportion of its population. This position was, of course, I think, contested quite strongly by Judge Xi when he says, by an appreciable section of the international community adhering to the policy of, let me read this again more carefully. The practice of certain nuclear weapon states is within the realm of international politics, not that of law. It has no legal significance from the standpoint of the formation of a customary rule prohibiting the use of nuclear weapons as such. Rather, the policy of nuclear deterrence should be an object of regulation by law, not vice versa. And he says this appreciable section of the community to which the opinion refers by no means constitutes a large proportion of that membership, and the structure of the international community is built on the principle of sovereign equality. Therefore, any undue emphasis on this practice of this appreciable section would not only be contrary to the very principle of the sovereign equality of states, but would make it more difficult to give an accurate and proper view of the existence of a customary rule on the use of such a weapon. So quite clearly you can see that there are deep fissures in the manner in which the court was sort of faced with these formulations about whether it should pronounce categorically or whether it should choose not to pronounce on the question of nuclear use. The outcome of the opinion is also quite fascinating, perhaps because in terms of the composition of the court normally consists of 15 judges. There was the death of a Venezuelan judge, Andres Aguilar Modzle, just died before the proceedings, and the president had a second casting vote. The most controversial formulation of the court was 1052E, which was basically about the formulation about general illegality of nuclear use. But on the question of self-defense, the court seemed to be dragging its feet a bit. Let me read the outcome briefly in terms of that particular formulation. Okay, so it's just this controversial 1052E. the court, in its majority opinion, in the dispositive of its majority opinion, says it follows from the above mentioned requirements that the threat or use of nuclear weapons would generally be contrary to the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict, and in particular the principles and rules of humanitarian law. However, in view of the current state of international law and of the elements of fact at its disposal, the court cannot conclude definitively whether the threat or use of nuclear weapons would be lawful or unlawful in extreme circumstances of self-defense in which the very survival of the state would be at stake. And of course, it added that there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiation leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control. Now, I think it's interesting that this outcome also has tended to be interpreted in different sort of ways, but I think what is quite clear when you read the opinion, and especially if you adopt a teleological perspective, what was the end the court was trying to serve, it's quite clear that the court placed a heavy accent on international humanitarian law. And it argued that if there is no conceivable situation in which nuclear weapons adhere to the principles of international humanitarian law, it would be illegal to ever use a nuclear weapon. So I think one needs to be careful in terms of how one interprets this particular outcome, but I think the weight of the emphasis clearly was on privileging the principles of international humanitarian law and outlawing nuclear use as a consequence of those principles of humanitarian law, which make it entirely implausible that nuclear weapons adhere or respect certain principles of international humanitarian law in terms of their actual use. Now, I think there are others who argue that it's also shifted the burden of proof on nuclear weapon states. It's sort of reaffirmed international humanitarian law. Some suggest that it's another instrumentality of shaming, which perhaps could be used by those who are supportive of nuclear disarmament. Finally, in conclusion, I think I would like to suggest that there is much in this opinion which is useful for anybody thinking about ways in which we can advance the legal argument on nuclear disarmament. I think the Nuclear Weapon Convention also flows from this particular movement, the World Code Project. The Lawyers' Committee of Nuclear Policy has drafted a full text of a possible or a plausible nuclear weapon convention, and at some stage I think there is likely to be greater efforts to move towards a more binding convention. The advisory opinion itself, in terms of its status, is not binding in the manner in which judgments are, but there's clearly a sense that the advisory opinion tend to be the most authoritative legal findings on a particular subject. So that's where we stand today on the question of nuclear use. It is, in a sense, a departure from an earlier sense that there was no clear pronouncement on the question of nuclear use. I think there is much we can perhaps take from this. It's also been invoked in various cases of civil resistance in NATO member states. They have invoked the ICJ advisory opinion 96. So it appears to have a life now, even in terms of civil court litigation.
The Scottish case in particular?
Yeah.
Do you want to mention that?
Yeah. Or perhaps in the Q&A, I'll take that over. So this is the broad layout in terms of the canvas, in terms of this particular legal pronouncement on nuclear use. I think there is scope to discuss and further deliberate, think about questions of the legal status and the manner in which law could sometimes prove to be an important ally in the cause of nuclear disarmament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Manish Shankar should be joining us. Vidya is trying to find out when. But till he arrives, I'd just like to do two things. One is make a few comments myself on the moral, ethical, and humanitarian issues involved in the use of nuclear weapons, and then also throw open the discussion for the three interventions that have been made till one roof, Amarjeet and Siddharth. Look, nuclear weapons have horrified people, ever since the very project of making them was conceived. I mean, the whole idea that you can make a weapon which is so powerful that it can destroy life on an indiscriminate scale, on a mass scale, it can lead to mass extermination, and eventually, in fact, life on Earth itself. Right? These are the only armaments that are capable of actually eliminating all life. The complete break in this cycle of life, not just human, of plants, animals, everything that we know to be living forms. It has horrified people for a number of reasons. As Amarjeet explained, it's partly because the argument put forward for pursuing the nuclear weapons research in making nuclear weapons lost much of its validity, and people like Leo Szilard, who was one of the scientists involved in the Manhattan Project that led to the bomb, and scientists such as Einstein pointed out that Germany by this time, it was very clear, was not making the bomb, was not trying to pursue that project. It had failed to do so, and so the United States should stop, right? A dishonest argument was proffered, which is that we will acquire the capability but will not use it. In fact, this was demonstrated even before Hiroshima. In fact, the nuclear age began not on the 6th of August 1945, but on the 23rd of July. 16th of July 1945, when a nuclear weapon was tested at Alamogordo in New Mexico, and this was proved. This was a plutonium-based weapon, and it was shown that this can work. And some of the people were so frightened of the possible consequences that they thought they might ignite. It might ignite a huge fire in the world as a whole. So it's sort of, anyway. The argument proffered for the actual use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was that this would bring the war to an early end and save many lives of soldiers and civilians as well. And we know that this is simply not true. And any number of generals who were involved, including Eisenhower, Curtis LeMay, and so on, have said this is nonsense. We all know this is not true. This is not why the weapons were used. The weapons were used to announce that this is now a new epoch in the world, which is going to be dominated by a nation that possesses the most destructive weapon ever invented, and this is a political message. So it's a but anyway, the fundamental point about nuclear weapons is that they are not, as Siddharth explained, they are not legitimate weapons of any kind, not of war, not of self-defense, and for a number of reasons. First and most important, they quintessentially target unarmed civilians, non-combatant civilians. Non-combatant civilians are immune. One fundamental principle of the laws of warfare is that you must not target non-combatant civilians. Nuclear weapons are pretty useless if they're used in the battlefield, like tactical weapons and so on with small yields. Their horror and their impact lies precisely because they're used against civilian populations. Okay. Second, they kill indiscriminately on a scale that is completely impossible to comprehend. The idea that you can kill 2 million people at one go. The bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was tiny compared to the kind of weapons that many countries now possess, including possibly India, right? Its sort of explosive yield was of the order of 10 to 14 kilotons, 1,000 tons of dynamite. I'm just telling you what, if you were to put 10 or 20 kilos of dynamite beneath this building, you can bring a large part of it down. So you're talking about thousands of tons of such explosive power concentrated in a very, very small volume. And today you have countries which have megaton, millions of tons in their weaponry. In fact, the total arsenal of the world has a megatonnage, which is or explosive yield, which is more than 1 million Hiroshima bombs put together. So you're talking about real mass scale extermination, right? This violates the principle of proportionality. The laws of war and the Geneva Convention say yes, you have a right to use force in self-defense against an aggressor, but that force must be proportionate to the harm that has been done to you. You cannot, if somebody just fires, a small gun at you without killing you, you have no business to bombard them with cannons and with F-16s or whatever, right? So there's some this is completely disproportionate. Third and very important, these weapons they cause harm and damage which is extremely cruel, degrading and inhumane. As you know, at least a third of the energy from the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was converted into radiation, which kills over a long period of time. And the situation in both these cities was so bad that it was often said that the the living would envy the dead, because this is a horrible, slow death from a poison against which there is absolutely no cure. So thousands of people perished in this extremely cruel way, very, very painful, helpless, humiliating way. And so this criterion again is violated, which is why actually the the distinction that we need to make, I think, is very important. We may be individually pacifists, we may have a distaste for war. I think we don't even understand how terrible and cruel wars are, because we haven't fought one for a long time, not in our modern history, not a proper modern war, nuclear war, that we must never lose sight of. And that's why I think this moral dimension must remain central, and we must not lose it. We mustn't get lost in the idea that there are strategic arguments which are going to win out. Fundamentally, we believe, and I think many of us in CNDP honestly believe, that some historic evils, sort of epochal evils like colonialism, slavery, nuclear weapons, can only be rolled back because, and can be defeated because, large numbers of people mobilize the moral conviction that they're bad and must go. Apartheid ended not because the ANC acquired superior power over the apartheid regime, but because billions of people in the world were horrified at its injustice. And precisely that kind of anti-apartheid struggle, which became a solidarity movement across the world, put enough pressure on the regime to make it completely unviable. And so these are the kinds of moral pressures that will ultimately tilt the balance against these historic evils. And I think that's why we have to generate this pressure, and we mustn't lose sight of this perspective. So I'll stop here. Invite questions, comments, and so on. Manishankar Iyer is on the way, and he should be here shortly, but meanwhile, please be as precise and brief as possible.
Amarjeet mentioned that it cannot be a one-issue movement. It's not just nuclear weapons are not just the most dangerous weapons. It has to be part of a comprehensive, general and complete disarmament program. And the fact that nuclear weapons exist today and it has not been abolished, I think the blame lies with the peace movement. Let me point out that there was a treaty, a joint treaty between US and USSR on 20th September 1961, called the McLaughlin Accord on General and Complete Disarmament. And McLaughlin Accord was signed at the initiative of the non-alignment movement. Because on 5th September 1961, 29 heads of states signed a joint letter addressed to the President of the United States and and USSR, and the Prime Minister of the USSR. And subsequently on 20th September 1961, a treaty on general and complete disarmament on the very proposals which with the non-alignment movement. It is the most comprehensive treaty, which is unanimously adopted by the UN General Assembly on 20th December 1961. And the peace movement, why has this treaty disappeared from the agenda of the peace movement? This is, I mean, with the introduction of the NPT, the macro zone accord was completely sidelined. And NPT only legitimized the possession of nuclear weapons by the 5 nuclear weapons, and the right of use of nuclear weapons was legitimized by the NPT. And the peace movement, last 50 more years, 40 or more years, have been supporting this bogus and bogus treaty, and completely sidelining the macro zone accord. And the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan is the successor to the macro zone accord, And now nobody talks of the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan. Why is NPT the focus of the peace movement? Which has been a totally bogus treaty, and why has it become the focus of the peace movement? So I hold the peace movement responsible for the sidelining of the issue of general and complete disarmament.
Thank you. Are there any other questions pertaining to this point, or?
Yeah, I have a, sorry.
Yeah. Please just introduce yourself when you speak. This is Jaiprakash, ND Jaiprakash from CNDP and Delhi Science Forum.
Hi, I'm Vidya Shankar Iyer. I was part of the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan group as an advisor, honorary advisor to the group. Hopefully Mr. Mani Shankar Iyer should be here soon to talk about the report. So I won't talk about it right now, but just to carry this discussion forward. Tillman was mentioning, in his address, I don't know how many of you could hear him clearly, mentioned and Achin also sort of pointed that out, that even a small use of nuclear weapons, and he mentioned a certain figure, less than half of 1%. I just want to clarify this, and this is also adding to what Jaiprakash has just said, the peace movement being responsible as well. This is a fudging of facts. What this figure comes from a report that Alan Robock and people did on what will be the impact if there is a nuclear exchange. And for their study, they took experimentally the idea of an India-Pakistan exchange. It's not that they felt that, to give them credit, it's not that they felt that this is the most likely nuclear exchange possible. They just wanted to study what will be the effect. And they assumed that India and Pakistan would use 50 weapons each. That means a total of 100 weapons used. Now, if you calculate the total number of weapons in the world, it's about 17,000 odd. So this comes to less than half of that 1% that they're talking about. So when they tell people, they constantly only tell people this, that less than half of 1% of the total nuclear weapons held in the world, if it is used, then it will, and I spoke to Alan Robock and I said, why did you have to, put it this way? And he said the principal concern in the study was that it would produce smoke. And what you need is, if there is a nuclear exchange, there must be smoke produced. So he actually said, if there is a nuclear weapon detonation over Israel, there wouldn't be so much smoke. In other words, there wouldn't be so much, it wouldn't affect food production so much. But India, Pakistan, there's a lot of scope for smoke to be produced, and therefore this would happen. And I felt that the peace movement is going wrong. You can't fool people. There is a report there that can be studied by scientists around the world. You can't fool the non-nuclear weapon states or the nuclear weapon states with studies like this. If you go around telling the world that, you use a very small fraction of the total number of nuclear weapons, I asked a question then, why would India and Pakistan use 50% of their nuclear arsenals in any exchange? It doesn't make sense in an India-Pakistan context to suggest that there are 50-50 weapons used. If you want to just show that it is because of the smoke that is produced halfway across the world, you can still be affected, then just say that. And it doesn't matter whether it's India, Pakistan, or any other state. So unfortunately, this messaging is not, according to me, going right out from ICAN or from others. They're constantly repeating this figure. The only concession, shall I say, that they give is don't mention India and Pakistan directly or specifically. But if you see any internet resource on Alan Robock's speech, you will get the report itself and the specific reference to that. So I just want to clarify on that figure. And I also want to come back to the idea of the ban treaty that Tillman was talking about. They're talking about a ban treaty as opposed to an abolition or a convention that gets rid of nuclear weapons completely, production, storing, etc., etc. And they're using the nuclear weapon-free zones, which has about 115 states as a part of various nuclear weapon-free zones around the world, to sort of bolster support for a ban treaty led by non-nuclear weapon states. This is a very interesting and a very bold step forward, no doubt, of some of the peace movements to suggest. But the problem with it is the nuclear weapons-free zones, as we know, are non-starters. Most of them are. And you have problems in their implementation. But what you do have are states who have agreed to be a part of a nuclear weapon-free zone. So they're constantly, even in their talking about the ban treaty, they're constantly building up support from the nuclear weapon-free zone states. That's the 115 states straight away. And therefore, if you look at the 125 number that has come up now at the UN First Committee, you're talking about, just about 10 states more than what the nuclear weapon-free zone states are. And the other problem is that the peace movement itself, where does the funding come from? Now, if you look at some of the organizations there, they're members of the NATO. The European states like Norway and so on, who have lots of money and do, fund these organizations. They fund ICAN, for instance. Now, it's difficult for a state like Norway, which organized a conference in Oslo in March this year on the humanitarian approach. It did not call for a ban treaty. In Oslo, they did not call for a ban treaty. What they said was, we are purely discussing the repercussions of on human beings if any nuclear explosion takes place anywhere. So they just wanted to talk about the humanitarian impact of the use of nuclear weapons, and just that, and nothing more. Now, the peace movement is trying to build this forward. But they can't build this forward and get funding for the movement if they're going to trash the NPT. But nevertheless, they ask for a ban treaty because the NPT has failed in producing a suitable result.
Having come into this conference with Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who has recently been appointed as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Disarmament. And I think we're very fortunate to have him here because we may get some sense of where the government of India is going from him. And certainly we'll get some sense of where he is going from him. It was one of the recommendations of the Prime Minister's group on the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan, whose report I brought with me here. This was presented about 2 years ago, in which we recommended, among other things, that there should be a Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Disarmament as a symbol or an earnest of our interest in reviving the goals to which India had been dedicated from independence onwards, indeed from before independence. I'm strongly of the view that it was not our recommendation that resulted in Mr. Sood's appointment, but his own distinction as a professional diplomat who has been involved in the world of disarmament for a substantial part of his career. He served in Kabul also, so they sometimes make use of him to see how we can arm Afghanistan rather than disarm the country. But inter alia, he's handling disarmament for the government of India. And therefore, I think what he has to say will be of rather more practical significance than what I've been asked to speak about. But let me try and sum up what we have to say as briefly as I can, because I would like to give time to Ambassador Sood. Our recommendation went as follows. That number one, we believed that India was really sincere about nuclear disarmament. In the years from 1945, when Mahatma Gandhi reacted with total horror to the dropping of the atom bomb over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right up to that unfortunate day in May 1998, when we became a nuclear weapon power. We became a nuclear weapon power at the instance of an opposition party which was briefly ruling the country. But the enthusiasm with which the Congress party supported that bomb and has since done everything it can to make us a nuclear weapon power that is not only recognized as one on a de facto basis, but also to get us some kind of de jure recognition as a nuclear weapon power, on which condition we've agreed that we could even join the NPT, did not augur well for the future of the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan. And so it did come as a pleasant surprise when, at the level of the Prime Minister, it was decided in October 2010 that some of us who had been associated with the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan and others who had since made a name for themselves in this area might get together and try to see whether there was any continuing relevance of that plan or its objectives or its methodology for moving the world in the direction of nuclear disarmament, implicitly nuclear disarmament leading eventually to general and complete disarmament. And the conclusion that our committee came to after examining all that had happened in the previous 23 years at that stage, it's now getting to 25 years, but at that stage, the 23 years after the presentation of the action plan, was that, in our view, the 5 or 6 essential elements of nuclear disarmament continued to remain valid, and that it was not really feasible to add anything to those 5 or 6 points. Number one, that the process must be universal. Second, that it must be time-bound. Third, that it must be non-discriminatory. Fourth, that it should be phased. And fifth, that at each phase we should be able to transparently verify that compliance was universal. So these were the fundamental points that went into the RGAP, that is the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan, in 1988. And the goal that was given was that while there are various stages of disarmament, including what has become much better known since then, such as the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the Fissile Materials Cutoff Treaty, they were all mentioned in the plan as necessary steps, but with the important proviso or caveat that each of these should be linked to the eventual goal of time-bound elimination of nuclear weapons. Moreover, that if we ever got to that goal of time-bound nuclear weapons being dismantled, then we would have to sustain that world order beyond disarmament. And if the world continued to be guided by the traditional principles of hegemony and aggression, exercising influence beyond your borders and so forth, then it might not be possible to sustain a world beyond nuclear weapons. And so we would have to have a mindset change that could take us to what is, I think, the most important formulation of Mahatma Gandhi's attitude towards this, which is that we should have a non-violent world order. So you had a basic set of principles, which were the ones that I've just elaborated before you, and then a methodology which was phased. So in each phase, what could be attained? And it was postulated that in a period of 22 years, from 1988, we would be able to reach the stage where we could have a world without nuclear weapons. But obviously, even at that stage, 22 years was not a magic figure that had been pulled out of a hat. It seemed feasible at that stage, but it was always obviously negotiable as to whether it would happen in 22 years or 12 years or 32 years. The point was to be clear in one's mind that we were not going to undertake a step towards disarmament as an end in itself. Now, subsequently, of course, this was done before the Cold War came to an end. And in 1988, there was no indication whatsoever that the Soviet Union would be collapsing within 2 or 3 years and would be ringing, therefore, down the curtain down on the Cold War. But nevertheless, it was felt that that we could move in that direction, and accordingly, they said CTBT yes, provided it is linked into a chain which ends with the elimination of nuclear weapons. FCMO yes, but provided it ends, it's a link in the chain that leads towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. So it was very important that the goal be affirmed and be given a time-bound reality in exchange for everything else that's ever been talked about in nuclear disarmament, being steps towards that end and not steps in themselves. And there is a very interesting passage in the speech that the Prime Minister made then, the full significance of which I must confess, as one of those who was involved in the exercise, I didn't fully comprehend at the time. But in retrospect, when I read the speech, it's clearly there that what Rajiv Gandhi was saying was what we had been effectively saying since at least 1974, that is 14 years earlier, and probably 7 years earlier before that, at the time of the NPT, that the world cannot really be divided into nuclear weapon and non-nuclear weapon powers, that there is a third category who are the threshold nuclear weapon powers, and that as of 1988, all these threshold nuclear weapon powers were on this side of the threshold. But it wouldn't take very long for them to cross to the other side unless those who were nuclear weapon powers would definitively move in the direction of capping, reducing, and eliminating their nuclear weapons. Now, this expression, capping, reducing, and eliminating nuclear weapons, was actually Clinton's formula for India. Those were the instructions he'd given for our nuclear weapon program. But I don't think they understood, I don't think they still understand the irony of the NPT, partially in its preambular portion, but most importantly in Article 6, actually recommending that this should happen. Instead of which, instead of capping, we had an escalation. Instead of a reduction, we had an increase. And instead of an elimination, there was the determination to persist with these. Nevertheless, we had greatly welcomed what happened at Reykjavik, which amounted to saying that at least it's acceptable to think about disarmament and to move somewhere in that direction. And then all of you know about the START exercises and the START II treaty, etc. But at that stage, when in 1988 it was calculated that the two nuclear weapon powers had between them the capacity to destroy the world 51 times over. And that by the time they got into the START exercises of the early 1990s, they had helped us to breathe again by reducing their capacity to destroy the world from 51 times over to a mere 17 times over. Now, if a person kills one person, he's called a murderer. If he kills several persons, he becomes a contender for the Prime Ministership of India. But if he massacres people on a scale that will result in no humanity and no world, then he's a world statesman. And it was this that was attempted to be pointed out by Rajiv Gandhi, that you've got weapons which you cannot really use, but as no weapon had ever been made which had not been used, there was always the prospect, however distant, of its being used either by deliberate design or by accident. And once that happened and led to a set of exchanges, then of course we are going to be in a world without weapons, yes, but also without any human beings, and with the only survivor being the cockroach. So we were talking not about warfare that takes place on a battlefield, as had happened until the Battle of Waterloo, and perhaps even up to the Franco-Prussian War of the 1870s, but which had gone beyond battlefields into countries and civilian populations during the First World War and more horrendously in the Second World War. We were talking about a conflict which would result in the end of everything and everyone. In the Mahabharata, we have the concept of the ultimate weapon, which is the Brahmastra. But the Brahmastra is used to destroy the enemy. This was more like those things that the boomerangs that the aboriginals of Australia throw, where it goes out, it hits something and then comes back to you. Except this time it would be the bomb that would come back at you, and you'd be finished. And in Indian terms, it means really that if you send some madman with a suitcase which has a bomb in it to leave at the Lahore railway station and then come outside and use a remote, true, Lahore will go up in next to no time. But if the wind is right or wrong, within 8 seconds the radiation is going to reach Amritsar, and certainly within 8 days it would have reached Delhi. So for us, I think we need to understand it in these terms, whereas obviously Lahore and Amritsar are meaningless terms for somebody in the West, where you'd have to put it in even more stark terms. And the fact is that they were put in very stark terms there, which hasn't happened in India. There was the Neville Shute novel called On the Beach. There was the riposte to that, which was called When the Kissing Had to Stop. And those were the big books of my youth, which alas is a long time ago. But it led to the campaign for nuclear disarmament in the United Kingdom and similar movements around the world. And so there was a great deal of awareness in the West as to what might be the implications of nuclear war. And as an undergraduate in the United Kingdom, I was there at the time when a fringe play called Beyond the Fringe was a sensational hit. It was a satirical program in which they pointed out that the best thing for you to do is to go into supermarkets and buy a lot of groceries, because they're given to you in brown bags. And then if you can stitch these brown bags into a kind of burqa that leads from the head to the toes, then apparently brown paper is a very effective repellent of radiation. It was also said that we should have bomb shelters built in such a large number that when the nuclear attack took place, then within 4 minutes, every Briton should be able to get into a bomb shelter. And in this satirical program, which took place a year or so after Roger Bannister had broken the 4-minute barrier, the stand-up comedian says there are some people in this great country of ours who can run a mile in 4 minutes. So this was, although it was in fun, although it was in novels, and of course there were a number of serious reports, there was in the West, along with this arming with nuclear weapons, a very popular, widespread understanding that however effective these weapons might be in destroying the enemy, they were equally effective in destroying yourself. And I think that psychological restraint played quite a major role in having leaderships in these countries frequently reject advice for the use of nuclear weapons. They were to have been used in Korea, at least at the request of the field commanders. They were restrained by a general himself, President Eisenhower. They were advocated for Vietnam, and President Johnson restrained them. One of the problems that Nixon faced when he was encouraging China to join Pakistan in repelling the Indian effort to liberate Bangladesh, it would appear from this book called The Blood Telegram that has just been published, was that he said, but no, Henry, he says, I'm not going to permit you to allow a nuclear war between China and the Soviet Union. So there was, at the level of public opinion, at the level of political authority, a certain understanding of the need to not use these weapons, however great the provocation. And this in circumstances where it was often felt that a Western or several Western national interests needed to be promoted by the use of these weapons. I don't see that in India at all. There is very little public understanding of what would be the consequences of nuclear conflict. There's very little debate about this in our media. There aren't any short stories, let alone novels, that deal with this issue. And therefore, our group was of the view that one extremely important task that would be required to be undertaken as a follow-up to this report would be the educating of public opinion on what would be the consequences of nuclear war, whether provoked or unintended or accidental, and to give examples from the past of how close the world has come on more than one occasion since 1945 to the use of nuclear weapons. Although all of us are sitting around this table only because good sense has prevailed on each one of these occasions. They haven't actually been used. What is discomforting, however, is that in the history of war, the crossbow was regarded as the ultimate weapon. There was a time when the horses of Genghis Khan were regarded as the ultimate weapon. There was a time when tanks were regarded as an ultimate weapon, when aircraft were regarded as an ultimate weapon. When one doesn't quite understand in 2013 why such a fuss was made over Picasso's painting showing what had happened in that Spanish town beginning with G. Guernica. We don't know why, because the horrors that we've actually been through are very many more. And the only use that I've ever seen sensibly made of the bombing of cities was during my posting in Hanoi, where the Americans would very kindly, they'd given advance notice that they'd bomb Hanoi at 8 o'clock in the morning and again at 4 p.m. in the afternoon. And the Consul General would, like a good shepherd, guide his entire staff into the basement, which was our bomb shelter, and he'd sit there whiling away his time while the bombs rained around us. And because he'd get bored waiting for the Americans to kill him, he decided that he would fill in a very imaginative way, the price returns on the basis of which our foreign allowance used to be fixed. And his argument was that since the IANAS, the Indian Audits and Accounts Service, actually stands for the Indian Iyer and Iyengar Service, and that Madrasis are temperamentally incapable of being courageous, that no auditor would ever come to Hanoi, and therefore he could raise the prices as much as he wanted and increase his foreign allowance exponentially. And my main contribution to ending the war in Vietnam was to freeze inflation in Vietnam, because I said I wasn't going to sign these. Then my staff said they'd get into trouble for having put up these false returns in the past. So the compromise we arrived at was that for the next 8 months that I was there, we wouldn't allow prices to rise any further. But these were, if this is the way in which life could be normal under a blitzkrieg, you can see how insensitive people have become to the danger of war. When one listens to the speeches, or one used to listen to the speeches of Jawaharlal Nehru, it was almost comical how often he'd use the word peace. But in recent times, do you see that word being used? It's not, because for somebody of Jawaharlal Nehru's generation, the First World War started when he was 25 years old, and the Second World War ended when he was 55 years old. So it was overwhelming that war was the reality and peace was the exception. But we are slipping now into the phase that Europe slipped into between the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and the outbreak of the First World War, where it was believed that the balance of power would ensure forever the protection of the peace, and that the interdependence of economies would ensure that nobody would be so stupid as to start a war which would only bankrupt them. And Norman Angell had written a remarkable work, which was a great hit in 1909, called The Great Illusion, in which he said that the illusion was that you could get any kind of prosperity by conquering other people's territories. Because his argument was that with the interdependence of economies, war, wherever it was started and whoever started it, would ultimately bankrupt themselves. And all the evidence now that is in shows that by 1917, Britain was completely broke. And if the Germans hadn't stupidly brought in their U-boats and started sinking anything in sight, who knows, Germany may have won that First World War. And equally in the Second World War, as the master of my Cambridge College has just published a book called The Last 1,000 Days of the British Empire, he shows how Roosevelt deliberately set out to bankrupt Britain during the Second World War so that the Brits and the French would not be able to recover their empires, and a Pax Americana could be established in place of the Pax Britannica. So people tend to forget over time. And I think it's because of this lack of sensitivity to what might happen if things went wrong that we have a very gung-ho spirit in the country as a whole, in our media, and in large sections of our government, that the nuclear weapons that we've acquired are a very good thing. And that all the arguments against nuclear deterrence, which we had set out at great length between 1945 and certainly up to 1988, a load of sentimental twaddle, and that what we really need to do is to utilize the fact of our being a nuclear weapon power to become militarily, economically, and politically stronger and have the world respect us. So what our report does is to try to take advantage of this, to say that when we were not a nuclear weapon power, but we were threatening to become a nuclear weapon power, the RGAP, when presented in 1988, lacked credibility. That it looked as if it was a cover-up job, and perhaps it even was a cover-up job. There are certainly colleagues of mine from that time in PMO who are bruiting it about now, that it was it's a huge feint, that it was, people would be, the aim of Rajiv Gandhi was to pull the wool over the eyes of everybody, because the real objective was to order our scientists to move in the direction of a bomb, and then to celebrate the bomb when it came 10 years later. But I like to believe that many of the arguments that were made, irrespective of the purpose for which they were made, were in fact valid. And that there's a mound of documentation on why we were advising other people to not believe in nuclear deterrence and to not do this balance of power being converted into a balance of nuclear terror. And in the speech that he made, he argues that the worst form of terrorism is the nuclear bomb. Now, the word terrorism didn't quite have the same connotations in 1988 as the Americans came to give the world after 9/11, but that's the expression that he uses here. So it seems to me that the arguments that were used then are valid, that it is unlikely that India will accept the plea of a wet like myself, that we should get rid of this stupid weapon that we've acquired, but that it might be possible for us to get rid of this weapon if everyone who possesses these weapons were to give it up. And the salience of these to military doctrine and foreign policy has, it seems to us, declined somewhat in the Western world and in the other countries that have these nuclear weapons. And that if we are going to move forward, it can't be on the basis of the NPT, because anybody who moves from being a non-nuclear weapon power to being a threshold nuclear weapon power gets spotted fairly early, and then there is this great tussle, as we have seen with North Korea and Iran, as to how to preserve the NPT only in respect of horizontal proliferation, without adequate attention being given to vertical proliferation. But because the pressures on this are so strong, there is now the slightest, but still discernible, movement on the part of the existing nuclear weapon powers to at least contemplate the possibility of capping, reducing, and eventually eliminating their nuclear arsenals. So the situation is actually more favorable today for the RGAP than it was in 1988. That because we are a nuclear weapon power and could, if we wished, become the first state with nuclear weapons to actually advocate the elimination of nuclear weapons, our credibility goes up rather than down by the fact that we have become an NWP, at least in our own eyes. And to take advantage of this, the strategy that we advocated was the following, that at the multilateral level, everything is gridlocked. Okay, I'll finish in a minute. Everything is gridlocked, that you cannot have any work done in the Conference on Disarmament because the Pakistanis have hoisted the Americans with their own petard. The Americans were the ones who were behind Resolution 1.1 of the United Nations, which is back in January 1946. They said that we should work towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. And the Pakistanis have said that since you have said in the CD that no subject can be taken up without everybody's concurrence, and you refuse to allow us to discuss 1.1. Therefore, we refuse to allow you to discuss the Fissile Materials Cutoff Treaty. And that has gridlocked the Conference on Disarmament. So we've recommended our moving on this front through a series of concentric circles. The main point right at the heart of the concentric circles is the United States of America. And we've said that since we have a strategic dialogue going with the US, we should engage the United States of America in discussing how we can move towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. The second concentric circle is also virtually a 1 point, which is the Russian Federation, with whom we have a large number of countries who enjoy the nuclear umbrella, but who were completely quiet while the Cold War was on. But now that there isn't a Cold War, while continuing to hide under the nuclear umbrella, they have started becoming very vocal about nuclear disarmament. Many of those are countries that till the last moment were opposed to us in the nuclear suppliers group, and therefore were referred to by our nuclear experts as the Gang of Six or the Gang of 10. But it was this Gang of 6 or 10 who kept the message of India on nuclear disarmament alive through the period that we were battling the consequences of having become an NWP ourselves. So they are there, we can engage with them, and their goals seem to be similar to ours. And then we have the Pakistanis, the Israelis, the Iranians, the North Koreans, who are in it or almost at it, whom we can also talk to. And finally, we have the non-aligned movement, which was originally set up. And if you read the first resolution that they passed in Belgrade in 1961, it deals almost entirely with nuclear weapons and war. Go back to the original spirit, say that even if at that time the word was appropriate, non-aligned, fundamentally we are a peace movement. And Indira Gandhi here in Delhi at the 7th Non-Aligned Summit described the non-aligned movement as the world's biggest peace movement. So essentially as a peace movement, we have a leadership role there which we cannot have in NPT review conferences because we don't belong to the NPT and don't wish to belong to the NPT. So in those circumstances, to engage the non-aligned movement so that those members of the non-aligned movement who are party to the 1967-68 treaty, they can raise our voice on their behalf over there. And perhaps a series of these bilateral engagements could eventually lead to a distinction that the US ambassador to Geneva was willing to concede to me that there is a distinction between multilateral discussions and multilateral negotiations, and that we could have these multilateral discussions if we prepared the ground for it. And for this, we recommended that there should be a special envoy. So now that the Prime Minister has caught the back end of the tail and said, right, I have a special envoy on disarmament, I now leave it to Ambassador Sood to tell us what he intends to do to make the tail wag the dog. Thank you very much.
Yes. We are going to postpone the lunch break by a little time, so there should be some time for discussion of what has been said and what Mr. Sood is going to say. Sure.
Well, first of all, it was only this morning that I was told about this event, and Dr. Vidya Shankar Iyer sent me an email forwarding a flyer about this event and said, that if possible, if you could drop in for a little while. And while I was sort of juggling around with my schedule to see whether I could come here in the morning or afternoon, Mr. Manishankar Iyer walked into my room in office, and I asked him, I said, what are you doing here? I thought you were supposed to be speaking, and I thought I would come by and listen to you. He says, no, I just came to pick you up and we'll go there together. So since I also had the pleasure of listening to him as we were driving here, and now you can imagine how much time it has given me to prepare my own thoughts for talking to you, something which I was not at all sort of prepared for. But having spent many years dealing with disarmament, he would probably not remember because he was already a joint secretary and I was a first secretary. In fact, I was at the mission in Geneva in 1988, and while he had the more glamorous task of perhaps writing the Prime Minister's speech, I had the less glamorous task of being in Geneva and providing inputs for the 3 background papers, which most people seem to have forgotten, which were presented at that time, including one on new technologies and their implication for the arms race. From there till in Delhi and so on. And I also happened to be dealing with these issues when we became a nuclear weapon state. And I was also then involved in the white paper that we presented. So I don't think that 88 was a mistake, and I don't think that 98 was a mistake. As he himself, as Mr. Manishankar Iyer said in 88, what were the motivations behind the Rajiv Gandhi action plan? They're still arguing about it. He and his colleagues are still not sure as to whether it was born out of strong conviction, moral conviction, or whether it was just something which was part of political rhetoric or something. But I think that in any case we are not going to be able to decide on that for the simple reason that the only person who could have settled the argument and put it to rest, namely Rajiv Gandhi, is no longer here. So that debate can continue ad infinitum, but I don't think it adds anything or takes away anything. Therefore, I begin from a far more realist proposition of saying that 88 was right, and just as 88 was right, 98 was also right, because the circumstances changed. Now, what is the common thread that ties up 88 and 98? The common thread is that India remains the only nuclear weapon state that is willing to envisage its security in a world free of nuclear weapons. Namely, we still maintain that our security would be enhanced in a non-nuclear world, and not only our security, but the security of the world would be enhanced in a nuclear weapon-free environment. there are other nuclear weapon states do not subscribe to this. And why I say this is a continuity is because right from independence we took initiatives for promoting nuclear disarmament. And I think many of you are familiar with it, and with the various initiatives that were taken right through the 50s, 60s, and so on. You know, calls for cessation of testing, calls for cessation of atmospheric testing, then calls for non-proliferation. Many of these initiatives that we took resulted in multilateral agreements, sometimes agreements that we could join, and other times agreements that became distorted, and where we then had to have domestic internal political debates as to whether we could then join these agreements or not. To take a simple example, we were among the first countries to call for a ban on nuclear testing, and this is going back 50s. Ultimately, what happened was that in 1963, the treaty that emerged from the negotiations was called the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which banned testing in the atmosphere. Now, what it meant was that at that time, the countries had also perfected the art of testing underground. So it was not a comprehensive test ban treaty. Now, in hindsight, you can say that India had always called for a comprehensive test ban treaty. Therefore, should India have joined just a treaty banning tests in the atmosphere or not, the Partial Test Ban Treaty? Eventually, India joined the Partial Test Ban Treaty, although we knew that it was very much less than a perfect solution. We moved a resolution on cessation of proliferation in 1965. It led to negotiations, and then it led to eventually, in 1968, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. Once again, there was a major internal debate as to, and you know what the Non-Proliferation Treaty, you know, it sort of said that countries that had exploded a device before 1964 were nuclear weapon states, and the other were non-nuclear weapon states, and all the rest of it, and the threshold business that Mr. Manishankar Iyer explained very eloquently. At this time, therefore, the debate in India was whether India should join or not join, and eventually it was decided that India would not join the NPT. Because these are decisions which have to be taken on the basis of existing political reality. At the same time, we continued to work for nuclear disarmament. India did not go nuclear. It's not as if India was secretly planning to go nuclear or had built bombs in its basement or any such thing. We continue to take initiatives about prevention of nuclear war, about fissile material cutoff, and so on. In 1988, and by the way, the initiatives did not end in 1988. I know he doesn't go beyond 1988, but we continue to take initiatives certainly after 1988 as well. After 1998, we introduced the resolution on reducing nuclear danger, which called for a global de-alerting of nuclear weapons. We introduced in 2002 a resolution on WMD, weapons of mass destruction and terrorism, something that was subsequently in 2005 taken up by the United States and made into a Security Council Resolution 1540, which is mandatory. A General Assembly resolution is recommendatory in character, as you know, where we drew the attention of the world in our resolution in 2002 to the fact that because as terrorism was increasingly seen as a new global threat, we drew a linkage and said that terrorists acquiring weapons of mass destruction could be a catastrophe. And therefore, this is something that needs to be prevented at all costs. And this is what led to UNSC Resolution 1540. But what I'm trying to say is that so we have continued to take these initiatives. And why we've done so is because we have maintained in our security calculus that India's security will be enhanced in a nuclear weapon-free world. Now, clearly, we know from the history of all arms control negotiations that, if I'm a poor chap and you are a rich person and I come to you and I tell you, hey, you don't need the money, give it away, I don't think it is going to work very well. But if I'm a rich guy and you're a rich guy and I come and I say, I don't need the money, you also don't need the money, I think it might be easier to persuade you. So therefore, as he spelt out the 5 principles, it has to be a universal approach, it has to be a step-by-step approach, it has to be it has to be a verifiable approach, and at every step, at every stage, there has to be a degree of stability, because if the system or if countries start thinking that this is going to lead to instability, then I'm afraid they will not be willing to participate in a process like that. How do you begin the process? I don't think, I think sometimes it is misleading when we start looking at roads that lead to nowhere, and the NPT is one such road that in this, but if this is the destination that we want to get to, then the NPT is certainly not the road that will get you there. I mean, it will not work. I think the only way to get there is to chart out a new road, and you have to do that on the basis of working towards a global no first use, which can be converted into a global non-use, reducing the salience of nuclear weapons in nuclear doctrines, which is what global no first use will provide for. Measures which increase the lead times, de-alerting measures, which increase lead times in terms of deployments and making nuclear weapons ready for use. And as you move forward from no first use, de-alerting, non-use conventions, then the process of delegitimization of nuclear weapons moves forward. And once you have the process of delegitimization moving forward, then you can actually begin the process of actual cut down and elimination under verification. It's going to be a long, hard road, but it has to be a new road. So, as I said, my basic purpose in coming here was to come and listen to you gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, on what your thoughts are, and not to lecture to you. But before I eat up more into your lunchtime, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I wish you all success in your deliberations, and I do hope that through events like this you can actually begin to chart out a new path. Thank you.
Just 2 prefatory comments. There is a temptation on the part of the Indians to project India as somehow being particularly responsible as a nuclear power, and things are much more complicated than that. The only nuclear weapons state which has had its main party in opposition twice to say that we will have unilateral nuclear disarmament if we come to power was Britain. And the Labour Party on 2 occasions said that if they come to power, regardless of what anybody else does, there'll be unilateral disarmament. Of course, when they came to power, they repudiated it. A very dignified and important person who was a leader of the European anti-nuclear disarmament movement, E.P. Thompson, said something very perceptive. He said about nuclear weapon states and their spokespersons, he said, time and again, we have had such spokespersons refer and invoke a universal demand and goal to which we can all agree, which is universal global disarmament, precisely in order to justify the obstruction of the necessary measures which are steps towards that goal. I will leave it to you to interpret that how you wish. The three questions that I have. The first to Amarjeet. The logic of the CPI, and I'm going to ask the same question from Prakash in the afternoon, the logic of the CPI and the CPM coming out in opposition to the 1988 tests, even as other countries had nuclear weapons, should be that we would want India to give up nuclear weapons even if other countries don't, because you're already opposed to India having it even if other countries are having it. In the case of the CPM, there was an article in the People's Democracy by Harikishan Sujit, which in fact suggested that they would be open to the idea of a South Asian nuclear weapons-free zone. I would like to know from you whether there is any discussion or thinking in the CPI about something like this. My question to you, Siddharth, is that on the question of battlefield weapons, which are inhumane, chemicals, this, that, is there any law, and that would apply also to the issue of battlefield nuclear weapons, which of course have also been proposed by a number of people, so on. Is there any law that says this is in fact unacceptable here? Because of course the claim is that battlefield nuclear weapons are not weapons of mass destruction. All right. My question here is that even after the 1998 Indian tests, the position of the Indian government was opposition to the ballistic missile defense or national missile defense treaty. But in 2002, when Bush repudiated the ABM treaty, the Indian government dropped its opposition to the BMD NMD, and as far as I know, is even seeking cooperation with regard to the building of theater missile defenses, which of course, like the NMDs, are a spur towards the further arms racing, either regionally or internationally. So one, what's happened about the NMD and the forthright opposition of the Indian government towards that? And incidentally, with regard to the question of the no first use, we are not very clear about what the Indian position is, because it had a draft nuclear doctrine and then there was a statement in public in 2003 which was supposed to stand as the Indian position. It's not quite as explicit as it would be. Perhaps and one step would be to make it as explicit as possible. The Indian no first use thing, proposal is more qualified than the Chinese no first use proposal. So those are my questions. I can explain how they're more qualified, but I'm sure you know.
Professor Vinod Gaur, incidentally, he is the geophysicist and a distinguished scientist based at a place called CMAC.
I remember 1988 and how I and many of my colleagues felt very proud of what Rajiv Gandhi had done. We believed that it was a very eloquent reaffirmation of what Indian culture has always stood for. The civilization remembered by the works of Buddha and Gandhi. And I do not detect even a trace of tactic involved in that act. And I believe that it would be a retrograde step for us to cast doubts on that declaration that it was not an article of faith, but a kind of a contrivance to pull wool over everybody's eyes and declare that even as the Atomic Energy Commission will continue on its effort to nuclear weaponization. And I must admit to being a little shocked at the statement that what happened in 1998 was also correct. And I think unless we clear these obfuscations, we would be forever, blundering on from one misconception to another. banning of the biological and chemical weapons has already come into place. What nuclear weapons do is on a scale which is perhaps 1,000 or 1,000,000 times much worse. The argument remains the same. It's a matter of scale. And the larger the scale, the more horrific is the context. And therefore, I do have this fond belief that one day, just as we have succeeded in having other weapons, chemical, biological banned, this will also come to happen. But we should move in those concentric circles that Mr. Iyer talked about. Sounds very sensible to me. The one rather discouraging fact that I see between the time when Rajiv Gandhi made the declaration and now is that the large middle class that has grown has become so jingoistic, almost by a factor of 10 or something like that. Unless we reverse that, we'll find it very hard to push an agenda of that kind even in our own society. And we should do everything possible through rational persuasions, by educating people in various ways to somehow see that aberration is corrected.
Thank you very much.
Louder.
Use the mic, please. Yeah. Being recorded.
My question is actually addressed to Mr. Iyer. I listened with great interest. I'm a student of disarmament studies at JNU, and I'm still looking to develop my conception of what disarmament would mean. The 5 concentric circles framework that you mentioned, I'm very intrigued to first hear about what was the underlying logic for placing these countries in this order, and also how do we really in the post-90 reality place Middle East, the region, the bloc of Middle East, if we were to think of them as one cohesive unit, which is, Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other hand, and marked by all kinds of perceptions about them in the West as well as at home. How are we positioning them probably in such a framework?
Brief, because
Mr. Iyer, I just want to point out, just before you came, I referred to the declaration appeal led to the signing of the Macro-Zoran Accord on 20th September 1961. And Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan is a successor to that plan, I just referred to. But after 1998, the government of India has not taken any initiative to achieve the goals of the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan. And I don't know what, Mr. Sood has not referred to what concrete action which the government is proposing now with regard to the, on the question of global no first use, etc., de-alert, etc. What prevents the government of India from calling a nuclear weapons convention to put forward these proposals and take concrete action? Why is the government not taking any concrete action to call a global weapons convention, nuclear weapons convention?
Can you introduce yourself, please? And if there is any more questions, please raise your hand now, because we'll have to give the speakers 3 to 5 minutes to respond and break for lunch.
Thank you, Praful. I am Sudhir Gandotra, representing the humanist movement. It is very interesting that such conventions, meetings are taking place. But it is certainly a very sad thing that we still have to convince people, we still have to tell people that arms are bad. Forget about nuclear arms, any arms are bad. We still have to talk about this. I think in today's world, where the whole world is divided on various aspects, be it the gender, be it the borders, be it religion, whatever, I think we are not going to win this argument that let's not have this arm or that arm or that arm. Because the whole world, it seems, is being run based on a fear that you are my enemy. And if I don't overpower you, you will overpower me. And this fear comes from within us. I would only suggest and request that as real peace movements, as human beings, if we can start looking at this aspect, that why this fear has got ingrained in us, and is there a way to overcome that fear? If there is a way to overcome that fear, if there is a way to generate a new leadership that will come up in a fearless way, not fearless because they have superior arms, but fearless like a Gandhi, like a Buddha, fearless from within, then I think these arms of any kind will not have a relevance to life itself. If we can start looking at this issue, I think we might get a new way of solving this problem in a much shorter time. By the way, and this is something very big, but let me tell you this. Give me 1,000 IT engineers of the kind I want, and they exist, and no nuclear bomb can get released. This is possible today. So that is not the issue, because then after that something else will come up. It's the fear that is bringing us forward. The fear of the companies to earn more, the fear of the politicians to grab more, the fear of the others to grab more. It's the fear everywhere. Let's try to work on that while we work on these issues. Thank you.
Right. Jharna, and this is the last speaker.
Hi, everybody. I'm a documentary filmmaker for the last 25, 30 years in the backward regions of India with MKSS, with Narmada, now with Chhattisgarh. I've been documenting people's history, basically, the voices that have completely been muffled. So I'm going to speak from somewhere there. The nuclear debate is not separate from the world becoming a police state. It's not separate from the fact that today more than almost 2 million, I think, police personnel are being deployed in the back states of India. It's not separate from the whole mindset that there are more police than health workers and teachers. It's not separate from the fact that the way the education is being imparted even today is furthering the whole cause, which is not ours anymore, which is not in favor of humanity and the planet as such. So within this context, how do we want to take this forward, and how we see culture, which is something that interests me, and also I see that perhaps is the only hope. And how are we going to get companies like Tata, Vedanta, unfashionable, or Coca-Cola, which I've been documenting now for a long time, which have been polluting the rivers and are not being taxed? How do we get all these guys who are the bad guys in our own image, firstly to be recognized as the bad guys, and then to be taxed? And are we interested, people who are sitting here, who are responsible for some of what's going on in the world? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's proceed with Amarjeet, Siddharth, and then Mani and Rakesh. Thanks.
You said in 1998 we opposed Pokhran explosion. We still stand on the position. We don't welcome it. And as I stated in my deliberation, we stand on that position. And secondly, we, of course, universal disarmament should be the goal. And it can't be achieved in one day. So the processes have to be there. In that process, nuclear-free zone, South Asia as nuclear-free zone, is a good idea in that process. So we are not against it. We think that kind of idea can be promoted and Indian government, whichever brand it comes, the people's idea should be built up so that they can be pressure group for the governments to take a position on that. Third thing, I would like to say that we have to have universal objective. For example, I was working in trade union and I was also looking at the project of child labor elimination. And while my working over there, I could understand that 1986 Act is actually violating Indian Constitution, which talks of prohibition and regulation of child labor. So if our objective is not for abolition of child labor, it is abolition and prohibition and regulation, you can never get rid of child labor. Because you will be always looking at regulated, not to be regulated, this and that. So we were arguing with the government, whichever government was coming. From AITUC we were arguing that your objective has to be total elimination. No child labor at all. And then you can set up processes how you are going to do it step by step. This is we said, and we continue on that position. We are not away, because what we have seen, that whole discourse has ultimately led into these children can work, these children cannot work, you can work in this area, you cannot work in this area, and this never works. So same way, if we look at this issue, objective has to be universal disarmament, and processes, phases and all, and honesty. I agree that transparency has to be there. Whatever is stated, is it getting followed? If it is getting followed, is it being monitored? If it is really happening? For example, on Syria, now there is a monitoring also. No? Yes, it is the chemical weapons are removed. So that all is necessary, and I feel that it is very, very important to work with the people, changing their mindset. If we are talking of a particular time when the people's opinion was valued by the political leadership in this country, and today if we talk of people's opinion being valued, you have lots of jingoism. But it doesn't mean if jingoism is there, the people's opinion is in favor of India being very superpower with nuclear weapons and all. Those who believe that this argument is wrong and this path is wrong, they in the name of, because the people are wanting that, they will keep quiet. No. They have to work in every hard position to see to it that this illogical understanding is corrected and proper direction is. I think somewhere I understand agony when Andy Jayaprakash was saying why peace movement has not tried to, you see, push the things, and why peace movement has failed. That itself shows that we are not consistent, whereas warmongers are consistent. We are not consistent, persistent, and working hard on the issue. As much jingoists and those who want war situations for their benefits and profits, they are persistent and consistent. So proactive role has to be there, and more of seriousness on this issue has to be there. It has to be there at conceptual level. Then only your conviction will be there, and once conviction is there, you will move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I pass on the mic to Siddharth, I'd just like to add in this same vein a question that I think both Mr. Iyer and Mr. Sood might want to address, which is are their recommendations and their perspectives geared at also a dialogue with civil society and a constant interaction, so that they take on board what peace movements and people within it have to say about the process. I mean, I've always believed, for instance, that while non-alignment was a great idea, it remained confined to the state level, and it never actually trickled down to mass consciousness in a serious way. Now, it's very important to address people and to get them involved in this process on an issue such as nuclear weapons. So, please, yeah, sorry.
Thanks. I think there was one specific question you had on
but you're welcome to address.
Okay, the other issues on battlefield weapons. I think generally in terms of the principles of international humanitarian law, they apply as much to conventional weapons as they do to weapons of mass destruction. And I think Nicholas Grief, I think, distilled 7 key principles which he thinks applies generally in terms of even conventional weapons as well as weapons of mass destruction. One of which is, of course, to suggest that it's prohibited to use, I quote him, prohibited to use acidificating, poisonous or other gas and all analogous liquids, materials and devices, including bacteriological methods of warfare. So this is clearly, I think, making a mention of specific weapons which are clearly prohibited in terms of the usage. It's spelled out in law. But in terms of the general principles of humanitarian law, all of them apply even to conventional weapons. So the notion of neutrality, for instance, or the distinction, principle of distinction between combatants and non-combatants. The principle of unnecessary suffering, disproportionate to the purpose of war or to the purposes being served by the use of a particular weapon. I think all of those are equally applicable when it sort of concerns conventional weapons.
Well, specifically, I have to answer the young lady. I'd like to offer to you that members of my group, myself included, are at your disposal. And you're welcome while you're working on your thesis to interact with us, if you find that to be useful. And we could then argue out perhaps more in detail why these different concentric circles have been identified by us. Basically, our principle is that the country which has an overwhelming number of these nuclear weapons is the United States. And that now the Russian Federation can no longer be equated to the Soviet Union in terms of an arms race. And in fact, it was in many ways the arms race that destroyed the Soviet Union and put in its place the Russian Federation. But the Russian Federation is second, but second to no one else. Between the two of them, the United States and Russia, they have approximately 95% of all the extant nuclear weapons. The other concentric circle is of those who are declared and recognized nuclear weapon powers. Then I've slightly distinguished between them because from an Indian perspective, the Chinese are overt and the Pakistanis are overt also, but one is de jure, one is de facto. And so I think we do need to talk to them as being very special to us. And then the other concentric circles are those who have a nuclear umbrella because they're not denying themselves that umbrella. So in fact, they're saying their defense is connected with somebody's nuclear weapon, if not their own. But nevertheless, they seem to be ready to talk disarmament. They're taking many initiatives in this regard. And finally, there is the non-aligned movement because we need a forum where our voice is greater than our own. And I cannot think of a better forum than the non-aligned movement to push our case, especially where we go unrepresented, which is in NPT forums, where in fact the movement being made on under Article 6 is something that we need to leverage. Again, I would agree entirely with you that ultimately we have to get to a multilateral negotiation. Because all these bilateral contacts are aimed at creating an atmosphere and setting the stage, if you like, for a multilateral discussion system, or which are of select numbers of countries rather than more or less universal as the Conference on Disarmament is. Not everybody is represented there, but whatever they do ultimately gets referred to the General Assembly. So then there everybody is participating. So we don't think that the CD is a restricted forum. It's a forum of people who are interested and then move on. We don't have any alternative to that. Insofar as zones of peace are concerned, we've always wondered whether zones of non-nuclear weapon zones are really valid in a world where the impact of any use of nuclear weapons cannot be confined to a country or even a zone, or possibly perhaps even to a continent. And so we don't really see that for ourselves a nuclear-free South Asia is an answer to the larger problem that so long as nuclear weapons exist, whether with us or with others, the danger of or the consequences of a nuclear war cannot be averted. It's truly a global phenomenon and therefore is not really susceptible of definitive regional answers. But if regions of the world wish to have it, we don't stand in their way. It's simply that we don't think it's entirely appropriate for India, and that we should be at the forefront of getting universal disarmament done rather than the forefront of merely attempting to get regional disarmament done, because our region, does it or does it not include China? Is it an Asian zone you're talking of, or a South Asian zone that you're talking of? Then finally, I think we are laying out a possible framework for moving forward. And whether the government chooses to go down that path or not, so long as they go down some path, I think that's fine. And while my stress was on 1988, and I've been quite correctly reprimanded for thinking that somehow the clock stopped in 1988, the fact is that all these other moves are discrete moves, and we haven't consciously linked them to the ultimate objective or made it conditional on its being linked to the ultimate objective. But they're all very useful in themselves, and they do keep us in play. But we did have a working paper which we circulated in 2006, which constitutes in some ways an update of the RGAP. We examined the compatibility between the two, and we said that we had no difficulty whatsoever with proceeding on the basis of the working paper if you think that a 25-year-old document is too old a document to move on. But that's only because we found the WP reflecting what was there in the RGAP. I don't even think it's necessary for us to invoke Rajiv Gandhi's name at every stage. I just want to see us back where we used to be. Up until 1998, we were a world champion for disarmament. We were associated with the idea of disarmament. After 1998, I don't think we can claim to be the standard bearer. But I feel that notwithstanding 1998, we could become a really significant standard bearer, as Mr. Sood said, the only nuclear weapon power in the world to actually believe that our national security would be enhanced in a world without nuclear weapons rather than enhanced by having a world with nuclear weapons. So we've got a big first step in Ambassador Sood being named. It's unfortunate that he's being named towards the end of the current UPA2. I don't know what will happen after May of 2014, but I hope whichever government comes in, whether it's ours, which seems a little unlikely, or somebody else's, which seems more likely, or anarchy and chaos, which seems the most likely, that at least the office of the Special Envoy for Nuclear Disarmament will be preserved, and that we can build on it until we're actually able to deliver. But if we do not champion this cause with conviction and just leave it as a kind of symbolic gesture, we love our bomb, but we'd like to tell you that we're ready to get rid of it, but don't do anything particular about it, then I don't think anything we say or do means much. But I was surprised that my group was set up at all. So I can only believe that it was set up because there was a purpose to setting it up, that there was a desire for us to move to the vanguard. It's taken 2.5 years to take the first step of appointing a special envoy, and that too at the fag end of the government's term. But still, the good is oft interred with the bones, and so let it be with Caesar. Thank you.
Would you like to respond to some of the other questions, including some by Achin?
Refusal of the Indian government to condemn the repudiation of the ABM Treaty and the question of the MNP.
That will have to be by an expert. I only know the wood, I don't know the trees.
All right, Rakesh.
Well, first of all, I don't think that the ABM treaty was between US and the earlier Soviet Union, and if the treaty is abrogated, it is a decision in which government of India certainly is not a party to. So in that sense, we have been active participants in the Conference on Disarmament, in the ad hoc committee of prevention of arms race in outer space, and I would only urge all the learned people here to take a look at some of the documents and proposals that we have put forward in that particular forum, which is the one that deals with these issues, as also in the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which has a legal subcommittee and a technical subcommittee. About the initiatives that we've taken, I think I did mention that, but perhaps the gentleman, well, maybe I went through it too fast. I talked about, because I think in 1988 what was presented was a comprehensive approach, non-violent world order. Now, that's a tall order in any case. So there was a feeling that perhaps more concrete, specific steps may be a more realistic way, and which is why the proposal on global nuclear de-alerting was put forward, which is why a proposal, because you also have to tap into what current concerns are, and which is why the WMD and terrorism was put forward. In 2006, kind of a working paper on principles which provide in short form the steps which can be taken to move towards a nuclear weapons convention were put forward through delegitimization, global no first use, global non-use, reducing the salience of nuclear weapons, and gradual reductions, verification, ensuring stability at every stage, and so on. We have, throughout this process, certainly continued to support calls for nuclear weapons convention, whether in the United Nations General Assembly or in other fora. In fact, if you look at the speeches that we have made on disarmament issues, whether in the first committee or in the UN General Assembly or at the high-level segment in New York, you will find that there is always a strong call for nuclear weapons convention, which is a comprehensive global disarmament treaty which is non-discriminatory and verifiable. And I don't know of any other nuclear weapon state which actually supports this kind of a call. And which is what makes us somewhat unique, because there is really little point in arguing with reality. Reality is something that you have to accept. You don't like it, you have to work towards changing it. But merely arguing about reality, to me, is a pointless exercise. And the reality that renders India in a unique position is the fact that, having demonstrated its capability in 1974, it waited till 1998 before declaring itself a nuclear weapon state. And I think 24 years of restraint is something which is unparalleled in global history. And that is reality. And therefore I say that while 88 is valid, so is 1998. And what we have to seek is a common thread through it. And that thread is one of a commitment to nuclear disarmament and an actual behavior of restraint, which is what makes us somewhat different. Thank you.
Sorry, there was a question on there was a question on civil society.
Just a second.
There was a question on engaging with civil society, which is a major part of our report. May I ask Dr. Shankaraya to say how we are engaging with domestic civil society and international civil society?
Would you also like to say something about that? It's part of your agenda. I mean, that's also relevant. I mean, that's, yeah, briefly.
Should engage more deeply and widely with civil society, and towards that end, a number of measures have been recommended within the report. A small initiative that we took, the group took, was in 2012. 2011 we submitted the report, which was to simply organize a students' debate meant for students of the Delhi NCR region in various colleges and various universities. And it generated tremendous interest and enthusiasm, literally infectious. And we had support from the Ministry of External Affairs for that. And we had the ICWA help us organize it as well. And when we did conduct this, we found that there was overwhelming feeling among students that suggested they are not in favor of unilateral nuclear disarmament at all. But they all considered a universal or global nuclear disarmament. And the idea then was to start off with a debate in Delhi. It was held at Vigyan Bhavan, and then move that around to various other parts of India, wherein we can get students to interact, perhaps even have a platform on the web where they can interact and carry the momentum forward that we might generate in Delhi. This was one small bit. The other was to suggest that the MEA itself, it has a disarmament division, so that itself should interact with think tanks, with civil society, as widely and deeply as possible. And in fact, with Mr. Sood, I can tell you, with Ambassador Sood having become special envoy, one of the recommendations that we have put forward to him, and he's very open to it, which is what has brought him here, and I'm very glad to see him. He told you yourself, I just emailed him in the morning, and I'm very glad that Mr. Iyer was there to also bring him here. So it's indicative of the openness, I think, that the division certainly should have, the government certainly should have, in interacting with civil society and listening to various ideas and alternatives that can come up. You heard him, Mr. Sood himself say, a new path, a new road has to be found. Now, quite obviously, to my mind, the 2006 working paper plus the steps that he enumerated now of how we can move from a no first use to a no use to other steps, reducing salience of nuclear doctrines and all that. Well, all these are proposals, but how do you operationalize these proposals? And that's where the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan report becomes relevant, where we've suggested the concentric circles of dialogue. Can we start a dialogue? I don't know. I mean, that's for the government to take a call on. We do have some dialogue going on with various states, but is it possible to start these bilateral concentric dialogues centered on nuclear disarmament? And of course, a point was raised earlier about the role of civil society, and I'd like to say that the Indian government was so activist in the field of nuclear disarmament that we didn't really need or have any other, NGO or civil society group, CNDP excluded, of course, which worked exclusively or intensely on nuclear disarmament. But with the government having gone through 1998, there's certainly an appearance of a step having been taken backwards in this goal. So it's good to have the government of India declare that it is still interested in a world free of nuclear weapons, and it's trying to find a way to get there, and that it is interested in interacting with civil society. So I would suggest that let's not stop with the debate we started. Let disarmament education, which has been mentioned around the table, be taken forward also in a serious way, because that is very important, as Mr. Iyer was mentioning in his presentation as well. It is a part of our recommendation too, and it is only then we will be able to arrive at a new road or new path. And I think these proposals that India has, unfortunately over the years, India has introduced these proposals repeatedly, but they don't find much traction in the international community. So something has to be done in order to get that traction going. Thank you.
Thank you.
Praful, my question to Mr. Sood, my question was, what prevents the government of India from unilaterally initiating the process of holding a global nuclear weapons convention?
Convening a nuclear weapons convention conference.
Excuse me, how do you unilaterally hold a nuclear weapons convention?
Call for all the countries, hold a conference in Delhi and invite all countries of the world to...
No, I'm sorry, it doesn't work like that in practical terms.
Anyway.
If it worked like that in practical terms, then you wouldn't have all these multilateral negotiating fora.
Anyway, I think we should discuss this over lunch.
Countries are sovereign entities.
Repeated attempt to call a special session on nuclear disarmament has not happened in the United Nations.
Well, you live, I don't know where you live, let's say you live in a housing colony, okay? And there are 50 people who live in that housing colony, okay? The common areas in the housing colony are not kept clean. Okay, for whatever reason, the Resident Welfare Association does not work. Obviously, all of them suffer equally from this difficulty. Now, you can decide that you will have a meeting. You can do two things. Either you can decide you will clean it yourself, which is one way of going about it, which means that the equivalent of that would be that we go into unilateral nuclear disarmament. which is an approach which you are welcome
No,
to
I'm
have.
not talking of unilateral
No, all right.
disarmament. No.
The second option would be that you convene a meeting of, let's say, the Residents' Welfare Association Committee, or maybe all the residents themselves. Now, the fact that you convene a meeting, maybe they don't like you at all, and therefore they will not come to your meeting. Now, you can't force them to come to your meeting, right? So therefore, you have to create an environment by which they will come to your meeting, they will be receptive to your idea, and then they will go and do whatever it is that it takes to keep the community clean. Do I make my point, I hope?
Okay, I think we should continue beyond lunch, and let's now break. And the lunch is being served in the terrace pergola to the right. So please join.